morning. Glad to be here. My name is Thayer Luscian, and I lead the engineering team at Above The Fray. I'd like to start with a story this morning about World War II. So, in the aftermath of the Second World War, as the United States and the other Allied forces were in the process of pulling out of the Pacific theater, there emerged an uncanny phenomenon among certain groups of Melanesian islanders. These islanders developed the belief that if they were to replicate the steps, the behaviors that they saw from the military leading up to the landing of an aircraft, they could cause the return of those airplanes and the cargo that they brought with them. And so the islanders began building these mock landing strips out of sticks and bamboo and leaves. They built signal devices, and they would act out the process of kind of landing an airplane. It didn't work, obviously. No cargo was brought back, and it's kind of a funny story. But it did give rise to a painfully relatable aphorism called cargo cult programming. Cargo cult programming is essentially the proclivity of engineers and technologists to just mimic behaviors or patterns or things we see from other engineers or pieces of software. We don't know why we're doing it. We just see it being done in successful organizations, and we think, oh, if I copy it, then I'll also be successful. And when you think about it, it's almost as silly as building a mock landing strip out of bamboo and hoping it causes airplanes to come for a visit. And I'd like to focus on one particular area, DevOps. DevOps is perhaps one of the most onerous buzzwords of our time. And I think there's a pretty widespread belief that DevOps will save your life. It'll fix your marriage. It'll raise your children. You're going to be a better person for it. People really like to hype it up, but I don't think there's a very good understanding of what it is. If you Google it, this is what comes up in Google Images. You get this funky diagram here. So maybe it's that. In fact, some of these diagrams, if you look really closely, they just have screenshots of every technology logo you can think of. In fact, this one here, I don't know who made this, but it literally has Google Drive and Microsoft Word listed. So if you use Google Drive or Microsoft Word, I guess that means you're doing DevOps. Congratulations. No, what it actually is, the upper echelon of engineering organizations have found a way to release software more predictably and with better results by automating the process of testing the software and deploying the software. And it's enabled them to move really quickly with an incredibly high degree of quality. But it's not because of the tools they use. The cargo cult imitators will be very disappointed to learn that. It's because of the underpinning processes that they've developed around releases. Now, this is a big goal to set for ourselves. Completely automating all your testing and all the other aspects of releasing software is a tall order, and it can be done and is done by some firms in even the Magento industry with great success, but it's a lot to take on, especially if you're currently in a state without a lot of automation where things are mostly manual. So today I'd like to talk about releasing specifically and some of the blunders and rules that we can understand to help achieve some of the same results as these top-tier organizations without having to invest the hundreds of hours and thousands upon thousands of dollars to build the tests and execute them. So why is deploying so scary? Why do we all get the quivers and the heebie-jeebies when faced with the proposition of releasing on Friday at 6 p.m.? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Here are three main ones that I think apply to almost all software. First of all, you have unintended consequences. You might introduce a bug that wasn't there before. You might take the whole system offline. Maybe you will release a feature that wasn't meant to be released. There's a lot of potential to screw things up when you're making these big changes. releases also touch many areas of software. We're manipulating the code, obviously, but sometimes also the databases, configurations, other services. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and it doesn't help matters that you are often merging together the efforts of multiple engineers who are working across multiple different tickets and multiple different value delivery streams. So there are all these moving pieces, and it gets quite chaotic. And then in comes Magento and its unique, let's say, nuances. You have this extremely complex core application that's developed over the course of decades by thousands of people. And it's powerful because of how complex it is. But also, you and your team couldn't have built Magento. You can extend it, you can run it, you can customize it, but you could never have built it. Sorry if you thought you could. You couldn't. You couldn't do it, let's be honest. And while we can run it, the level of complexity that you have with Magento also carries over to areas like test automation, support, maintenance, et cetera. On top of that, you have all these proprietary components, the whole dependency injection model, the whole static content deployment model. There are just so many unique ways Magento does things that off-the-shelf systems don't support or aren't really designed for. And a lot of times, this is in the context of managed hosting providers, which I love and am a big fan of using, but also there's a certain degree of lock-in and lost flexibility in those cases. So you end up with this result of Magento being maybe a little bit more difficult to achieve this continuous delivery with. So you have a lot of headwinds, a lot of complexity, and that often, I think, leads to just some kind of foregone conclusions, throwing up our hands. It's just kind of how it just has to be like this. Maybe, but I don't think so. There are, I think, 3 classic blunders that many or most of us have been guilty of at one time or another. The first is slipshod testing, either not testing, maybe you're testing in production, maybe you're not spending as much time as you should, maybe you're not doing the right types of testing. Testing is one of the most obnoxious parts of software development and also the easiest to ignore or avoid. Then there's the whole manual configuration changes problem. Maybe as part of your change that you're releasing, you've made some tweaks in the admin panel directly, which Magento allows us to do because it's designed inherently to be very flexible. But now you have to worry about making manual changes as part of your releases, which adds more complexity. And on top of all this, there's oftentimes a little bit of funky business when it comes to actually preparing releases. Maybe there's some cherry picking. Oh, we don't want this ticket. Let me just put this over here. There's some sloppiness and laziness that tends to happen. And that's not specific to Magento. It's specific to programmers. So let's talk about some rules that we can use to counter these blunders and to perhaps develop a more sustainable way of operating. And I want to emphasize that there's a lot of nuance to each of these, and there's a lot that goes into releasing. But in my experience, this is a good starting place. So the first is to establish really fantastic testing rigor. I say test like crazy, mostly tongue-in-cheek. You actually have to be very regimented and deliberate and professional about your testing. There are many different types of testing, and they're each a pain, and you probably don't want to do any of them yourself because they take a long time to do, and they are repetitive, and there's a reason why people automate them. But these types of tests help us to eliminate uncertainty that our software is going to behave in the way we want it to behave, the way it's expected to behave. And eliminating this uncertainty enables us to release with better confidence and also eliminate the majority of those unexpected consequences. The key to eliminating uncertainty is to test everything whenever you change anything, which is a big, tall order. But as a monolithic application, Magento is very tightly interwoven. Each component is connected to another component, and there's a lot of room for these cascading unexpected consequences. So whenever you change any part of the application, you have to test the whole thing, and that's called regression testing. It's a pretty long-standing, widely used technique, at least in more rigorous organizations. Regression testing enables you to check everything, including things that, as far as you're concerned, have no business being tested. There's no way that's going to be impacted by this. That hasn't changed. Whatever. But that's what automated testing does, right? It tests the whole application, and that's why it's so effective. And so if you want to replicate that same level of efficacy and quality, you have to test everything too. Maybe by hand, maybe a combination of both, but you have to do it. And you really don't have to do that much other testing if you do regression testing. You should, to be sure. Edge testing, boundary testing, functional testing, acceptance testing. There are like 20 different types of testing. I could give a whole talk on that. But regression testing is super important because it focuses on the things that you're not focusing on, and it helps protect you from the things you otherwise would miss. Now, this only works if you're testing the exact same version of the software you're releasing. So you can't test, make changes, and then release. You have to test again. You have to test the exact same version of the software. And we'll talk a bit more about how we can achieve that. But I want to move on to our second rule, which is to codify all your changes. Now, this one maybe is a little controversial because it's again, it's a pain in the neck. But Magento has a beautiful admin panel, and you can just go in there and click a few buttons and make some changes. But if those changes are in any way tied to code changes, you need to use a data patch. Magento makes this very easy, relatively speaking. You can ship changes to data as part of your code base. And these changes get built during the deployment process automatically. They get executed, applied to the database, just like that. Which means there's no longer a manual dependence on somebody remembering to do something, which in general is a bad idea because people forget, they make mistakes, they're inconsistent, etc. And this actually complies with the 12-factor application. Some of you may not know this, but Magento is actually designed to conform with the 12-factor application paradigm, which is basically a list of arbitrary rules that we've all kind of come to agree usually result in better applications. And factor number 12 states that, and I quote, one-off admin tasks should be run as processes. And this is a way of achieving that. You're executing these one-off tasks as a process, so there's very little chance you're going to make a mistake and then do it right in different contexts. It's always going to be done consistently. It'll be done everywhere in any environment where Magento is run or built. And it reduces a lot of the risks and the dependencies that happen with releases. So again, this is another one of those things that it's genuinely a pain. I don't feel like doing it because you could just, it's the difference of making a few changes with your mouse and keyboard versus actually having to commit code to a code base. But at the end of the day, it's worth it. Our final rule is to package changes neatly. And this is what I was referencing back on rule 1. If you're going to test the exact same version of the software that you're going to release, you need to have a system for encapsulating and bundling and packaging your software app. And if you use version control, there's this magical tool called Git. You should try it. I hope everyone here uses Git. That would be sad if you didn't. But there are some very tried and true methodologies for packaging your code. One such example is GitFlow. It's been around forever. It's not exciting or flashy or innovative. It involves a lot of Git branches. But if you use a release branch, you have a very consistent way of releasing the exact same version of your code to both development and staging and production, or whatever environments you have in play. And this is important because as long as you're testing the same release that's going to be going to your production environment, and you've encapsulated all of your changes properly, you didn't do any manual admin panel changes or manual database editing, then you can be sure with a fairly high degree of certainty that there will be no bugs or unknown behaviors because you've checked for them, and then you've released this established, known, and trusted version of the software to your production environment. And this is what it's all about. And I'm not here to say that you need to use Git flow. You can achieve this same output with maybe trunk branching. That's another probably more trendy way of doing it. There's others as well. The point is that you are using a consistent method to encapsulate and release your changes, and you're avoiding funny business. Don't break the rules. Don't make exceptions. Don't, oh, just this one time. I just needed to, it's fine. It's not fine. Don't do it. That's when you're going to get burned. So as long as you follow these 3 rules, you have a pretty good shot at achieving successful, stable, high-quality releases. Now, I should caveat all this. My goal here is to share principles that are going to be valuable even if you're not at a place where you're able to automate a lot of things. Even if you're at a place where automated testing is still maybe outside of reach. But there's still some barriers to entry, some base level automations and best practices you should be following. I mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but you should be using source control, using Git. If you're FTPing your code between your I can't help you, I'm sorry. Fortunately, I think the good news is there's not a lot of that going on these days, I hope. The other one is you really should be automating the actual process of pulling code onto servers. And those are 2 things you could probably knock out in a weekend if you make your coffee strong, which is a pretty light lift when compared to the whole task of automating everything. So if you haven't already begun the journey of really focusing on your rigor around releasing and deploying, this is a great place to start. Make sure you've got version control that you're using consistently and in a way you trust, and make sure you're at least automating the process of pulling code to your server or pushing, however you want to think about it. Those are the 2 bare minimum things you need to be doing, and once you're there, you can start applying these other changes, which are all process changes. Testing is a process change. You don't need to write code to make it happen. It's a process change. Using data patches and other codification tools, it's really a process change. You're not rewriting anything. You're just changing the way you operate. And even our third idea of packaging our releases, it's just a new way of doing something. There's no architectural changes required. There's no refactoring required. It's just a new way of looking at it. So if you achieve basic automation and hold yourself to these 3 rules, you have a very high degree of confidence, and you have a good shot at achieving high-confidence releases. I'll be around after this. If you have any questions, this is my LinkedIn. I like talking about this, so feel free to hit me up. Any questions from anyone in the room as it is now? Hello.
Hello. So my question is like, you have a staging platform and production, okay? On staging, you can't update the database every day from the production. So even if your code is same, okay, you are deploying correctly, you are testing perfectly, okay, but sometimes we see the same thing working on staging, but it broke sometime on production. So how we figure out
Yeah, I think I see what you're getting at there. So I would recommend taking some effort to make sure your staging and production are relatively in sync. But in theory, as long as you're making all those changes with data patches and you're using version control to move it through environments, there's a pretty low risk that there's going to be some data change that's going to change the execution behavior of the app. Now, granted, it's not impossible, but I recommend, even if you're just changing an admin panel setting, that you would normally just do that with the data patch too, because you're better safe than sorry, and any change has the ability to make that impact. So unless it's like routine product maintenance or, say, content maintenance, in my opinion, and maybe this is controversial, every change to your database has to go through a data patch, because that's the only way you're going to make sure it gets tested and validated in the way it should be.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Any real-life examples of the things you would do to start testing your code? Like, where would you begin?
So I think it's important to start with the highest risk parts of the application, which is usually going to be checkout and order flow. So you're going to want to make sure that you can place an order. If you can do that, you're like 90% of the way there. It's going to vary from business to business, merchant to merchant. There are certain areas of sensitivity for different merchants. Some people, maybe there's some sales enablement tool that's really important, and if that breaks, all hell will break loose. Test that too. Really, you should test everything, but anything that has the potential to be noticed by someone important or impact revenue directly, that's the type of stuff you should start with. And those are also good candidates for automation. If you're going to automate some testing and maybe start rolling out a little bit of test automation, those are the best places to start because those are the areas where you have the most risk. Manual testing, definitely start there. Even automated testing, those are the ones you want to really focus on because it's all about risk reward and return on investment. So, if the worst thing that could happen if a component on the site breaks is like 2 people notice and they think it looks kind of bad, maybe not so great. But if the worst thing that could happen is the whole site goes down or you lose $100 million or something like that, that's a pretty good ROI to do some basic test automation or at least invest in manual testing. And for those who are new to testing too, I'm by no means the authority on this, on the actual testing part, but I would recommend doing some research. Adobe, eCommerce, Magento has some great testing components. You've got MFTF if you're really, really, really brave, or you could start a little smaller and do like unit testing, integration testing, and there are also some great third-party services and tools like Cypress that a lot of people have found great success with. So.
Speaking of Cypress, if you feel like that you have full test coverage with automated, do you feel a need to continue doing a full suite of manual testing?
No, I don't think so. So the way these DevOps organizations that I mentioned previously, the way they operate, they aim to make their releases as small as possible, and they release directly to production every time. So they'll say, I don't know, 3 lines of code change, and it goes straight to prod. It runs through the full suite of tests, and any new features that need to be protected or kept back are behind a feature flag. So there's like a toggle or a service that manages which features are exposed. But as part of this, you make your releases as small as humanly possible, which greatly reduces the risk. So if you're just changing 3 lines of code that impact some ancillary part of the site, the risk is already lower. Plus, you've already got a comprehensive suite of tests. And by spreading out the risk over a longer period of time, you have more grace. If someone knows, hey, this is like the checkout was like kind of slow, or like I had to click continue to check out twice, like those types of things, they can get noticed quicker without as cataclysmic of results. So yeah, in my opinion, and the opinion of these big tech companies, you don't really need to do any manual testing. So, but that's very brave. It's a big change. So.
More questions? Okay, a question from me.
Yes.
I've read somewhere, I cannot quote like word for word, but it said something along the lines, if your team is reluctant to release on Friday, that's a bad sign, which tells us that the processes are not in place or bad testing is there. So do you believe that following the 3 rules you gave us should give teams enough confidence to release on Friday night?
Yeah, we do it. We absolutely do it. And it's fine. As long as you are sure that you're not going to, because the whole idea, internally I call this high confidence releasing, because the idea is you know what's going to happen after you deploy, because you've practiced the exact same set of steps in a safe environment like staging, and so you know it's going to happen exactly the same way in production, and it usually does. I mean, we've had great results with this. I don't know when we release. I don't care when we release. These big automated companies, they release literally dozens or hundreds of times per day, every day, to production. So for me, a Friday evening release is, I mean, if you wanted, you could skip it, but I don't care. I don't feel the need to keep an eye on it because it's usually fine. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Let us thank Thayer.
Thanks, everyone.